Good morning, everybody. If you want to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2, it's where we'll be together this morning. Continuing to talk about who is Jesus. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a pretty not exhaustive list, but it was certainly a long list of all the names and titles that Jesus has been given throughout the Bible. And today what we're going to look at is, who is Jesus a threat to power? Now, this is going to be a theme that we're going to revisit over and over again because, frankly, it's one of the few things that never changes from the moment Jesus is born to the moment Jesus dies. He is a threat to power every second of his life. And we don't see a lot about the childhood of Jesus. We kind of go from the birth to a story where he's 12 into his ministry that begins around the time that he is 30 years old. But in these times, we see that Jesus is a threat to power. Now, last time I spoke, we started off in John chapter 1. And we really emphasized, we just looked at John's emphasis on Jesus being God. And by the way, I hope this is helpful. If you are a person who struggles with Bible reading, first of all, you are not alone in that. In fact, I would dare say you may be in the majority on that. The Gospel of John is always a great place to spend your time. There are other places, obviously, that are fantastic. Truly, surely, of course, I'm not saying John is better than anything else, but John is a very good, straightforward gospel focusing on Jesus. And it's a good place to be. It's a good place to start if you're not currently doing that. It is a good place to jump to if you are struggling. You're reading something else and, getting lost in Mosaical law or getting lost in some of the other things that happen where people get tripped up. Going to John is a great place to be. And John, of course, opens up by emphasizing the idea of Jesus is God. Now, why does he do that? Well, that's really going to set the tone for the other themes that he has, that he writes about through his gospel. And it's also a contrast to, say, a gospel like Matthew, where Matthew has a primarily Jewish audience. So when you go to Matthew chapter 1, you see things that would appeal to folks of the Jewish nationality. You're going to see things like you open up with the genealogy of Jesus. Because it's important that Jews that are looking for this Messiah, it's important that they know that he comes through the prophesied genealogy. That's part of what they're looking at in order to make sure that he is who they think he is. Or maybe they want to prove that he's not who they think he is. So that genealogy is first and foremost, and that's something that's going to be very important to Matthew's Jewish audience. And then Matthew goes into the conception and the birth of Jesus. Now, of course, when you talk about the conception of Jesus, there is a miraculous measure there, okay? And then there is this humble birth of Jesus. Now, after this happens, what you see, beginning in chapter 2, which is where we're going to turn here in just a moment, you have a visit from the Magi. So just to give you a little bit of a background on that, the Magi would be experts at the time in things like astronomy, astrology, modern science, things of that nature. Now, when I say that, I need you to understand what that means. You would be, based on what you know right now, an expert far beyond what they would be talking about astronomy, astrology, modern science. Okay? I mean, some of the things that we have lived for generations with, they had no idea. Okay? So when you think about that, I don't want you to have this modern view of a scientist. Okay? This is not the same. Obviously, technology is very limited. These are people who would read things that people before them had written, people who would spend a lot of time looking up and making observations. Okay? That's who they would be. And of course, they bring to Jesus these gifts. And these gifts have a symbolic value to them. The idea of getting gold, that is a royal, a king's gift. They, of course, give frankincense, which speaks to the deity of Jesus. And they give myrrh, which is typically a gift, a symbol associated with death. Interesting thing to give after a birth, right? But when we think about Jesus and we think about who he is, the idea of something symbolizing being a king, something symbolizing deity being God, and something symbolizing death makes a lot of sense based on what we know happens in the life of Jesus. So you already see Jesus being acknowledged as a king and being acknowledged as God from the very beginning based on the gifts that he receives. And we also, of course, see what is going to happen. I don't think these magi have any idea how it's going to happen. But you see this idea of death being a significant part of this child's life. You could argue, you would be right, that his threat to power is a big part of that death. But yet that threat to power doesn't wait until the end. It doesn't wait until Jesus is arrested and captured and convicted and crucified by his government, by the leaders. That's not where the threat to power begins. So go ahead, if you haven't done so, and open up to Matthew chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." Now remember, Jerusalem, that's where the leaders are. That's where the power is, right? Verse 4, "Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born." Now you notice he's not asking where Jesus is born. He knows that. He's asking, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? Why would he do that? We got to see if the prophecy is about him or not, right? We got to see if this is the one that we've been waiting for, or in the case of Herod, they've been waiting for. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Is this the one? So verse 5, "They said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him.' After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way." You see, Herod reached out to him and said, "I need you to tell me what's going on here. I need you to tell me where this child is." And then they receive a warning. They don't know. They think Herod's waiting like they're waiting. They think he's waiting to worship the king the way they are waiting to worship the king. And they're excited. And they get there and they are excited to be in the presence of the king. So we know what happens next. We know that Herod then orders this mass murder of children. Let me say that again in case that gets lost on you. A mass murder of children. A government-sponsored hunting down and murdering of children is what is ordered here. And through this, and we're not going to look at this scripture specifically, but as you would assume and as you probably know, there are a lot of warnings forthcoming from God to Joseph about protecting Jesus. Why? Because he is being hunted, literally. The child, the baby Jesus, is being hunted by the leaders, by those in power. When we go back to verses 3 and 4, we see these phrases. Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. Last week, Daniel got up and announced that him and Christine are expecting another child. Many of you, as I look out across the crowd, have been a part of an announcement like that, whether it's a coming child or a coming grandchild, whether it's a coming Harper. That was announced here too. We share those announcements, and they're always overwhelmingly 100% received with joy. Everybody's happy. I know you smiled behind that mask last week, and you smile every time that kind of announcement is made. We love children. Children are great. We love them, and we're glad to have them, and we always want more, unless they come back to your house specifically. Then we want other people to have more. But when Herod hears this, he's troubled. He doesn't take this as good news. So in verse 4, gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. He needs to know if this is the threat. Is this the threat to me? Is this the threat to my kingdom? And the answer that he finds, that he concludes, because of his actions, we know, is yes. This is the one that is the threat to him. But what does that mean to him? What does that mean to him? Why does he want to kill him? Why was it so important to make sure that Jesus, the baby, dies? And why is it worth it to do something it's so important to make sure that Jesus dies? We're going to kill all the little boy kids to make sure we get the one we need. That sounds crazy. It sounds crazy. But why is it so important? Well, first reason is it's good to be king, right? Who doesn't want that job? But let's understand what that job means at this time. It means power. It means wealth. It means recognition. It means people don't necessarily bother you unless they want to become king instead of you. Then it means violence. It means war. It means if you can hold on to the throne, it not only sets up you, but it sets up your children and your children's children and so on and so forth. Because this is an inherited role. It's taken on either by inheritance or by violence. That's the way kingdoms change at this time. I'm going to say that again because we want to put that in the back of our mind. Kingdoms are either inherited or taken by violence. So let's remember that when we start talking about King Jesus. But the big thing that it means to Herod, he wants to be king, and all these things are true. But the biggest thing that it means is that if Jesus is the king, then I, Herod, cannot be. If Jesus is the king, then I, Herod, cannot be. There is only one king. You know, Sean, I thought this was interesting timing. I actually texted Troy this morning in Bible class because there was a show fairly recently, that was very popular on HBO called The Game of Thrones. And talk about graphic, awful content. This show has plenty of it, right? But the premise of this show is the idea of just becoming king. Like, that's really the only point of the show, is getting on the throne, becoming king or becoming queen. And in the show, they had this what they called the Iron Throne. And the Iron Throne was this, it was, again, it's all for TV. But guess what? Someone's trying to kill you, so you've got to fight all the time. This show, although not realistic at all, that element of it is actually exactly the way things happened. Kill or be killed is the philosophy of those trying to keep power. And when Jesus shows up, and when Jesus has the prophecy that is made about him, he automatically becomes a threat to anyone who wants to rule. Amen. And what we have to understand is that fact is still true. Amen. People do all kinds of things for power. They lie, they cheat, they murder, they steal, they do all kinds. People do all kinds of things for power. People desperately want power. Amen. Now, in this country, we are more fortunate than many that we don't have nearly as violent a society. But let me just give an example of how desperate people are for power here. And I could give a gazillion of these examples, by the way, but I'll just use the most recent. The most recent election that we had in the United States was on January, I believe it was 4th or 5th, I can't remember. It was a runoff. There were 2 runoff elections in the state of Georgia. To be a United States senator pays about $174,000 a year. Okay? That's how much the job pays. In those 2, so there were 2 seats in the same state. Okay? For the runoff election, which means they already ran in November, okay? And there was money spent to win those elections. Then a new election cycle started once neither of the candidates running got more than 50% of the vote, because that's Georgia law. So you had from November the 4th, I think it was, I think that was election day, through January the 4th, was the time between these elections. And over $433 million was spent on the 4 candidates trying to win those 2 seats. $433 million spent to win a job that pays $174,000 a year. Obviously, it's not the pay. Either that or obviously people are really, really bad at math. I mean, atrociously bad. It's what people do for power. Amen. It's what people do for power. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to do that. It certainly doesn't make sense to kill all the male babies to keep power. For the record, I think that's worse. Okay? All right? But this is what people do. This is what people do. And when you understand that Jesus is really on the throne, we don't just say that, but when you really mean it, and you really understand it, and you know what that means, that it means it makes it all look silly. It makes every bit of it look silly. Because there can only be one king. When Jesus was convicted of blasphemy, one of the things he was asked, one of the parts that he was convicted, that he was charged with of being blasphemous is his claim to be the king of the Jews. That was part of what he was, part of the charge of his blasphemy. And in Matthew 27 and verse 11, he is confronted with that question. It says, now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? I don't have any idea what happens if Jesus says no here. Anything that you might say could happen would be conjecture on your part. You don't know. I don't know. No one knows. Okay? But we can safely say that if he was ever going to get away, it would have had to get away through physical means. It would have had to start with him saying no to this question. I mean, that would have been an essential piece to this. I don't think that would have worked either, but again, that's just conjecture on my part. I don't know. But when Jesus is confronted with that question, and Jesus said to him, it is as you say. It is as you say. And if you are a person that is in a position of power in Judea at this time, if you are a person of power over the Roman Empire, and that has now been expanded, you see, the Bible tells us about Jesus, about being ruler over all things, that every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. That means he's a threat to everybody, everywhere that's been in power. Because they're not. They are not. Not in any way that matters. Jesus is Lord. And I don't think, and we'll talk more about this later. We're just about done for today, but we'll talk more about this later. But when we start talking about that phrase, Jesus is Lord, that phrase is controversial. Just because in our culture we have heard it a lot and we've made it mean something and we've put it off to the side or we've put it somewhere, doesn't mean it's any less controversial than it ever was. Jesus lived in a time of empire. The Roman Empire was the power. And when people said things about Caesar, the things that we typically associate to being said about Jesus, at the time were said about Caesar. Lord of Lords, King of Kings, Prince of Peace. See, those are all phrases we only associate with Jesus. In the first century, that was not the truth. That was not the case. When you said that Jesus is Lord, you were essentially saying Caesar is not. Jason talks about this in Acts, by the way. This is not something I'm just making up. When you say Jesus is the Prince of Peace, you're saying Caesar is not. When you're saying Jesus is the King of Kings, you're saying Caesar is not. And when you really start to think of Caesar as a concept instead of Caesar as a man, you really start to understand what this means today. Jesus is Lord. No government, no ruler, no king, no president, no governor, no prime minister. Jesus is Lord. And Jesus' people proclaim him as Lord. And Jesus' people reside in a kingdom and try to spread a kingdom here on earth for King Jesus. That is what we do. That is who we are. That is what we are about. And that is a threat, folks. That is a threat. One of the dangers of our culture is we have we've kind of found a place for Jesus. We've kind of compartmentalized him and said, well, our government doesn't oppose Jesus. Well, no government has ever opposed Jesus on every issue. But they've all opposed him on something. All of them. Even ours. No matter who's in charge or running it. It's always true. Always. And Jesus is our King. There is no opening to that throne. There is no line of passing it on. Jesus is on the throne today, and he will be on the throne forever and ever. That's how this works. There is no overtaking Jesus. There is no coup. There is no army. There is no, effort. Well, yes, I apologize. There's always effort. There is no going to be successful effort in removing Jesus from the throne. Jesus is Lord and Jesus is King. And we have to know that that is a threat to some folks. But yet as God's people, we are to embrace that idea. And we are not to necessarily feel threatened by those entities, even though that's what martyrdom is, right? When you die for the cause of Christ, what you're doing is you're unwilling to remove Jesus from the throne for someone else. That's why they get killed, folks. Because the people that have died for the cause of Christ have typically died because of this power struggle. I don't care if you worship Jesus, but I don't care if you say Jesus is this, or I don't care if you have time for Jesus. I don't care if you really, really like Jesus, but Caesar is the king. And we will kill you if you don't acknowledge that. We'll throw you in a den of lions, maybe. Familiar with that one, right? Daniel, you can like God, but don't start putting him higher than he should be. It is important that as we move forward as people of Christ, as Christians, as people who are trying to follow God in this world, it is important that we put Jesus in his proper place. And by putting him, I mean in our minds. He's already in the proper place. But we have to do that in our words, in our actions. We have to be his kingdom amongst whatever other kingdoms are out there. Jesus is Lord, and Jesus is King. And just know that Jesus is going to be seen as a threat in that case. Amen. To anyone who really wants that spot. But we have to be willing to acknowledge that and live like that. Amen. And that's how we look at things. That's how we look at our lives. As our lives is going to be an active part of the kingdom of God. And an active worship of God and King Jesus. If this morning we can do anything for you or we can help you in any way, you can share that as we stand and sing.